21st. This work session is relating to AO 2023-66, 66 being the first ordinance number. So I am not leading this work session. I will be glad. Oh, first introductions, Mr. Presverdia. Introductions.
Cameron Perez-Verdia.
Zach Johnson.
Anna Brawley.
Daniel Bolland.
Scott Myers.
Meg Zalatel just said she's here. Christopher Constant on the phone. Mr. Rivera. Here. Mr. Cross.
Here, thank you.
Ms. Braga.
Here.
Mr. Salt. Ms. Martinez.
Here, thank you.
And I will just correct one thing. Mr. Volland is happy to be here. Who is planning to lead? Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you. So what you have before you today for documents is a marked up version of 2023-66. Its intention is to be an S version. What we've done is a little bit due to time constraints and a little bit so that we can get your feedback is just track changes into the original. Our intention is after this work session, taking your feedback to go and finalize the S version and work with council to put it in legislative drafting form. Just to, at a high level, talk about the substantive change, and we talked about this at the last work session a little bit, is it just switches into a single residential zoning district versus one that dealt with sewer and water. And the reason for that is because we believe that can be taken care of as a variable in the additional Title 21 work that'll need to be done. Additionally, as we previewed, and we're happy to see Mr. Voland now as a co-sponsor, we really took Mr. Voland's ideas around land use designations out of the 2040 plan. And we really tied this very closely to the to the 2040 land use plan. And I think it's important to point out explicitly that the 2020 comprehensive plan is the parent to the 2040 land use plan, and both guide Title 21. That is the hierarchy of these land use documents. And that's not always apparent. And so what we've done is we really tried to respect that hierarchy that exists and to keep the predictability and continuity with the 2040 land use plan and really make sure the two are tightly linked. Ultimately, though, the ordinance is so simplistic that it's not expressed in the now therefore resolves. It's all in the policy intent. And that's why you'll see such heavy editing in the whereas statements. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to our new co-sponsor, Mr. Voland, and then see if Mr. Cross, since he's on the phone, has anything he'd like to add.
Yeah, thank you. So initially, I, as folks may remember from our prior work session, I came forward with a counter proposal because I do think that the 2040 land use plan makes a strong case for simplification and streamlining of our current zoning. And I also think our current zoning, some of the restrictions are sort of out of sync with where the 2040 land use plan says we should be going in terms of housing choice, what types of housing can be built where. You know, for instance, I think when you look at R2M, for example, that is in the 2040 land use plan, R2M is included both under the compact residential mixed low and medium. And so it really is supposed to be this buffer between more intensive densities and uses. However, because of things like lot size and setback and other issues, a lot of that density that the 2040 land use calls for in that zoning is not functionally achievable. So how do we create more flexibility and, you know, in you know, the true purpose, address our housing shortage that we have here in Anchorage. And so when we had that prior work session, I was really happy to see the co-sponsors essentially I was more aligned with them than I anticipated. And I like where this is going. And I guess, Meg, I think you'll probably go over the other handout in a bit in terms of where we're headed. And I think that maybe, the public has seen the ordinance and it's been reported on. Essentially what we're doing is we're coming back down to a foundational level and we're saying, okay, we need to revisit residential zoning in Anchorage. And more information is going to be provided in this work session about sort of where we're headed. So I look forward to that. Thank you.
Well, why don't we go Mr. Cross first? Do you have anything to add?
No, they've summed it up real nicely. I do want to express that it is obviously the concern of all three of us sponsors here that we respect the land use plans, we respect what the long-range plans, what they're trying to do, we respect the rural areas, the residential, the urban, suburban. And all this is understand that zoning in itself is very unpredictable. Either rezones or variances can take a year, if not more, even at the basic level. And so how do we simplify that and move more of these constraints onto building requirements so we can achieve the same outcome that was intended, but more expeditiously and more affordably? And I really look forward to the conversation of how we do that. If you can build a 10,000 square foot house, why can't you build a 4,000 square foot duplex that looks just like a house? And so let's be a little more malleable on the zoning and put more of the emphasis on building requirements, which are much more negotiable and malleable and instead of the neighborhood. And I look forward to what we can do with this. Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, there was something that I wanted to say that slipped my mind. But, I think to Kevin's point about building code, also, I think I just want to make it clear that there's no intent on the co-sponsors for us to entirely eliminate residential design standards. And my colleagues will remember the item that we just passed at our prior meeting, where we chose to actually expand via amendment an ordinance that calls for, things like alley access requirements and sidewalks to be at grade, and had restrictions around, what percentage of a building on a primary street frontage has to have windows so that you can have eyes on the street, driveway widths. And so I think that all of those things are important when it comes to the shared space, because something that we hear a lot about is like the neighborhood character and the walkability and the livability and the quality of life. And so those are things that we have an eye to, and it was Member Cross who brought that amendment forward. And so I think that we can do both. I think that we can create more flexibility and simplicity when it comes to building housing, but also protect those things about our neighborhoods that are so important and that make everyone's lives better. Thanks.
So I just want to ask a clarifying question. I heard reference to an S version. I see a document that is in pretty intensive markup, but it doesn't say it's an S version.
So when I started, this is intended and will become the S. One, we ran out of time because, well, lots of things. Two, we wanted to get your feedback as well. And so the intention is after this, us to confer, finalize the marked up version and send it off to council to put into legislative drafting. Also, just procedurally, it's the intent for us to then lay this on the table to Tuesday night, but release it as soon as it's ready, because it'll be a supplemental item. And then it's also the intention of the sponsors to move to continue the public hearing on Tuesday night to August 8th as well. So there will be more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have in the queue Mr. Salt.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. So, members, also, I really appreciate going through the hierarchy of documents. I have several community councils, actually I have several community councils that have spoken against this, and I'm pushing to review or look at a proposal by Mr. Littleton related to focusing on a 2050 comprehensive plan. So I'd like you to explain a couple things of the timing of what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, which I think we've touched on already, and then address that note regarding focusing on a 2050 comprehensive plan. Thank you.
Ms. Alto.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Mr. Solt. So the timing is, the housing crisis is now and time is of the essence. And even undertaking this or undertaking Mr. Weddleton's proposal will take time. And we've actually set a really ambitious timeline of about 18 months. So we can either continue to go about business as usual, or we can take a bold policy step forward and then commit to doing the work. With regard to just updating the 2040 land use plan and starting the 2050 land use plan, I think we still run into the fundamental flaw, which is the restrictive zoning districts. So I view the land use plan right now as feeling like it's set in cement. And every time there's a rezone, we have to go do a plan amendment. We gotta chisel out this exception or this change we're making. However, if we shift from zoning districts to land use designations, what we're doing is we're putting the land use plan back on paper and providing the flexibility and predictability, it's still on paper, that is intended. So I don't see just redoing the land use plan without explicitly addressing zoning districts as being the fundamental change we're hoping to create to really simplify and streamline zoning and the ability to create more housing.
Can I also chip in on an answer to that question, Mr. Chair? Thanks for the question, Randy. You know, it's interesting. I think plans are great, but so is implementation. And one of the sort of, I think now recurring themes that we're hearing is when we make a move to allow more housing is, well, let us update our plan or finish our plan first. You know, if it's Holton Hills and the Crow Creek plan, or the Chugiak Eagle River updating their plan. So Mr. Weddleton's proposal, while I'm not averse to doing a 2050 comprehensive plan, I think that we have guidance in the 2040 plan, and we have not implemented everything that we can to move its goals and policies forward. For instance, Land Use Policy 1.4 provides direction. Use the 2040 land use plan and area-specific plans in conjunction with other elements of the comprehensive plan to determine appropriate zoning in the bowl, and evaluate proposed changes to land use regulations, which supersedes Anchorage 2020 Policy 4. Land Use Policy 4.2 provides direction to allow and encourage innovative compact housing types and a variety of housing options that respond to changing preferences. Policy 4.3 provides direction to promote balanced neighborhoods with diverse infill housing and provide opportunities for development of affordable and accessible housing that avoids creating areas of concentrated low-income housing. And then something that I think is very important that we need to address in our community when it comes to exclusionary zoning practices that keep people out of certain neighborhoods effectively is Policy 4.5, which provides direction to consider actions that will affirmatively further fair housing and avoid having the effect of housing discrimination in decisions regarding land use, allocation of housing opportunities, and zoning map or land use regulation amendments. So my argument would be that yes, we can further future planning efforts, but we can also use the guidance from existing plans to create the type of housing that the 2040 land use plan calls for.
I have Ms. Brawley in the queue and then Mr. Cross.
Yeah, a couple things. First, I want to state I provided this in an email to somebody yesterday who was asking if I was interested in moving the Weddleton proposed version forward, and as I stated to them, I personally am not interested in pursuing that for a lot of the reasons that were brought up in terms of the time that it would take to do a comprehensive plan. I know that we probably need to do one. We probably do need to look further out than 2050. I think it's not really in our best interest to just advance it by 10 years. And I just know as a former planning consultant, those take a lot longer. And so I certainly am not interested in that. I don't think that that's the next step. So I just wanted to state that. For the sponsors, I guess maybe I'm just not following, but if you could walk through, so it looks like the S version of the ordinance, or the draft that we have now, has one residential zone, and I understand the reason for removing the second residential zone. And then I'm having trouble understanding how that connects to these other pieces, the use table, and because they aren't covered. And then I also want to just say, I think there is value in setting broad policy direction first. I am also concerned, though, about not having those other details worked out, because there is a risk of saying, okay, we're going to do these things, and then still having these goalposts in place, and then subsequent processes and other things could get us pretty far away from those things if we don't have them put together. So I just want to put that on the table as a concern.
Thanks. Yes. I appreciate the question, because the code change, as I said, is really simple, right? And so we're working on an assembly memorandum that provides additional policy guidance about the process after the passage of this. And one is how we re-envision the use table, that if we do not have zoning districts, which is currently the top line of the use table, we would really like it to be considered. And the guidance we have is to start by using land use designations. Similarly, if you flip to the second page about the variable framework, we would like in that process for, through the typical Title 21 process, to go and evaluate the use table, lot coverage, setbacks, height, septic, slope, any other variable that applies to a lot. And let's take the best parts of Title 21 and import them over and talk about how universal they could be, or if they need to be specific to land use designations. So since we're changing the underlying premise of Title 21, which is zoning districts, and changing it to land, our intention would be to look at first changing it to land use designations. But we don't want to predetermine that outcome, because we're not the ultimate experts. We want that to be through the typical Title 21 process, where planning convenes experts and stakeholders, and we debate the merits, of that, and then that could possibly move forward. So that's how we wanted to provide a framework, but the code change itself is really small. Otherwise, we would be basically just engaging in not the large policy decision, but we would just be saying, let's go do a Title 21 rewrite and taking it all up together, which I think time is of the essence. And I don't know that without the larger policy guidance, we would end up where possibly what I've heard potentially the will of this body is, which is we really want to remove barriers to housing development.
Thank you. And one follow-up is, so I mentioned in the last work session, interest in thinking about, I see mixed use here as a land use designation, or it's a type of use. And maybe this is a question I just need to talk to planning staff, but I'm curious, because we're talking about residential zoning, which by its nature still segregates residential uses from all other uses. How would this play with the idea of, encouraging building in B3 zones or in other areas where, where housing is maybe appropriate, but this underlying zoning is not residential?
Thanks. So this wouldn't change the ability to build residential in B3 as it currently exists, because it doesn't touch the B districts at all. I hear your desire. I am worried, though, about opening up all zoning districts when our emergency is around housing. And then I took your feedback from last work session. And as I look at the land use plan, there's very little mixed use development in it, quite frankly. And so I think we have the opportunity with a public process to kind of use land use designations, that mixed use development concept, and actually maybe get more of what we've been hoping for, because we just haven't been able to realize it as much as we wanted to.
Go ahead quickly.
Yep. I think that it's also an example, like Member Zolotel, there's not a whole lot of this mixed use. So the plan is sort of inspirational in that way, in that it calls for some mixed use zonings. And, we have R3A, for instance, right now. I think there's only one lot in Anchorage that's actually zoned to R3A. So it was this idea of like, oh, we were going to have this more flexible mixed use sort of moderate density zoning, but effectively it's not being utilized.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Ms. Brawley. Next is Mr. Cross.
Thank you. Yeah, some good points have been made. I spent 5 years on the planning board, and I was very familiar with the comprehensive plan for all our areas. you know, and some that, like Crow Creek Comprehensive Plan that managed to just get ignored for prolonged periods of time. But, you know, it's either a plan or it's a suggestion. And what we've discovered oftentimes is that the plans were referred to when they were convenient, and when they weren't convenient, were often ignored. And so I do agree with updating them. But if we have a plan that we're not currently interested in following, then what is, I guess my question is, what does the update do? The Eagle River Comprehensive Plan laid out very strategic, specific areas for utility expansion, which unfortunately have been, you know, several people in our community have fought that in order to prevent more dense housing and just keep large lots, which I respect the decision to do so, but it is in conflict with their comprehensive plan that they all agreed with. So, I mean, you want to have a comprehensive plan, but you only want to follow it when it's convenient. And so I think that's part of the struggle you have. And I think an update, although desperately needed, might just end up being a 3 or 4 year process, just because I think it'll be difficult to get everybody to align. But I do think we can get aligned on simplifying zoning that sticks to, adheres to, and respects the character of the neighborhood, and go about this a different way where we can do it expeditiously and really make sure we have an involved public process. I really want to make sure people understand that it is the intention to make sure our public process is a transparent, inclusive, and well thought out. And that although time is of the essence, we will not negate the proper input from all the stakeholders. Thank you.
So I have myself in the queue, and I have a couple of questions. 18 months, you mentioned, Ms. Alto. What happens over 18 months?
Sure, great question. So if you take the variable framework, our hope is that we take each of these topics in turn and we say, okay, with one residential zone, first we should possibly start with the use table, because the use table will have to be updated, because at the top of the use table right now,
Mr. Salt, can you please mute your phone?
at the top of the use table right now are zones. So we would say, well, if we don't have zones, what else should we use? We're suggesting land use designations. Then you go through lot coverage, setback, height, all of the things we do during a Title 21 update. But the hope is that they're simplified, and we look at how universal the best parts of 21 can be across all the land use designations.
So what happens between 0 and 18 months for projects that come up in relationship to a specific area?
That's a great question as well. We've been in this territory before with the Title 21 rewrite. It has an effective date of January 1, 2025. One, we would want to work with planning to make sure everyone is well informed when the new code is going to take effect. Otherwise, Title 21, as it currently exists, will remain in effect.
So I have a suggestion, and I'm not a drafter, haven't been a supporter because I'm not a big fan of the Ready, Fire, Aim model, which is let's change the code and then figure out what it does. Would be to do what you're doing here, which I think is creating a new zone, which is just the R zone. And then chunk by chunk, pick 2 or 3 of the R zones and break them down and move them into the R category and contemplate them over the same 18 months so that you're not undoing, you're methodically going through and doing it. I think it's like it's the crosstab to your use table, your variable framework. It's like the crosstab to it, like where you run all of these things and then you have all of these zones that get filtered through it into your final zoning district. I think to me, that would be a way where you don't just ditch substantial chunks of the work, but you run every line of it through the function.
Yes, that's exactly what's contemplated, because every zone runs through a land use designation already in the 2040 land use plan. That's the disconnect we have with current code, is land use designations don't exist in Title 21, which is kind of baffling. But zoning does. But zoning doesn't really exist in the land use plan. And so we're marrying those up. Whereas if you go into each land use designation, you are chunking it into the zones. And there's a table in the 2040 plan. Like if you look at the compact mid zone or land use designation, it talks about which zones it applies to. So there's already a kind of a crosstab to those.
Right. So I think maybe you stated it backwards, running the zoning into across the land use as opposed to having individual zones at the end. The goal is to have just one residential zone. Okay, thank you. Who's next? Ms. Brawley, I think.
Yeah, just a couple of additional comments. And I'm thinking about this, not being a developer myself, but knowing something about kind of industry or business regulation. It is challenging when there's a period of transition, because I'm thinking back to what happened during the old Title 21 versus new Title 21. I think there was a year overlap where people could choose which they used. But I remember it also had the effect of basically people waiting a year. So again, I'm withholding, my opinion on this because I want to see what the new version looks like. But that is one concern about introducing that uncertainty. So I think that it would just be something to think about is for folks who do want to build something, are they just going to wait until this new permissive zoning, or how would that affect the year or so that this would still be in play in terms of the building season? The next one, just to state, is financial feasibility is important. And that is one of the biggest factors in what people build, whether it's profitable or not. And that's something we have limited control over. Zoning has one component version of that. But again, I think that's where thinking about where we can feasibly allow mixed use is important because I've from looking at multiple prior projects, often it is important to pair housing with a hotel, housing with another business use, maybe on the same parcel or as part of the same development. And that affects the financial feasibility. I also know we do have kind of mixed experience here with people who have built mixed use developments where they had trouble filling their retail spaces. So I also want to acknowledge that, but I don't think that it's an inherently bad way to build as long as it's done right. And then the third one is just observing on the use table. I think it is a good move to go toward more permitted uses because the part of the cost is having to go through things like conditional use. And so we should not, we should reserve things like conditional use processes for where there is concern, or things like alcohol licenses where there's other pieces. I guess that's a special land use permit, but it's essentially a conditional use permit. But one thing to think about is where should we still allow single family housing to be permitted. So there was a project I was working on with another city, not currently working on it now, but there was discussion about, for example, and they did still have multiple zones, right? So this is a different thing to think about. But in areas that are considered appropriate for higher density, one discussion was to require conditional use for single family development in those areas. And again, I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I want to offer it in the context of this work session, because then it requires justification for why you're building below what those land use designations are. And it flips on its head this idea, because right now it's showing no matter what, you can build a single family home across all of these. And then we treat multi-unit development differently. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, is where would we want to make it more where would we want to raise the threshold where you have to justify building single family homes when you could be building higher unit homes if it's allowed under the code? Thank you.
Next in the queue, I have Ms. Bronca.
Thank you. I really am all about simplifying the process of development, but I'm looking at, I still don't know how it's going to contribute to more walkable neighborhoods. When I look at the areas that I'm in, I don't see that opening up this residential zoning is going to give me a grocery store within walkable distance or a medical clinic. There's not the kind of land available that's going to happen. So instead, I see multifamily places going in that are allowed to street park, which then is going to make traveling on the streets not as friendly for pedestrians. And so I guess I'm just not really seeing where I guess that over time, eventually we can get some stores that come in, or, right away in the future that I'm alive, I can't see that this is going to make my area more, less need for a car. Because of the density that's already there. I also wanted to call out, as far as this change in zoning, allowing for more inclusive and equitable city. I can see that, you know, we all know that the population is moving south, that is trying to clog the better schools and this and that. And so I do think that there is some need to have more increased housing, like the apartments, triplex toward the south, to just sort of increase the diversity in those schools as well. And that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Ms. Alato.
Thank you. So the land use table that we've created, or this use table, was really applying the land use designations as they currently exist and what would be permitted today. And again, it's just demonstrative. We would have to go through this exercise. But what I wanted to bring up is a little bit of an anecdote. So the street I live on, I live in Rogers Park. It's all R1. My neighbor to the, I'm bad with directions. My neighbor to the right is a multi-generational family in a single family home. My neighbor to the left is a duplex. Interesting. Neighbor across the street is an old log cabin. My neighbor kitty corner to the left is 6 adults who share the single family house as roommates. And so what functionally is happening in my R1 neighborhood is what my land use designation suggests should happen, which is 1 and 2 family homes, because functionally that's what works for people. And so to me, the marrying of a residential zone with what the land use designations is doesn't substantially change my neighborhood from what it can be today, but it more accurately reflects what's happening. Similarly, in, I think it's College Village, the other side of Rogers Park, there's one street with duplexes, Northwestern, all the way down, abutting, of course, Northern Lights, the busiest part, but all the lots are the same and the houses are about the same size, but because of zoning, those can't become duplexes by right. So it's odd, some of the choices we made. And I think that we need to acknowledge the choices we've made and really functionally what's actually happening in a lot of neighborhoods. So I just wanted to share that because I don't think that people would realize the diversity of housing situations happening on a street in Rogers Park.
Can I also answer?
Sure, Mr. Rollins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Karen, I think it's a good question. You know, a lot of what we're doing is sort of targeted at infill and allowing people to live closer to all the resources that you just mentioned. So, you know, they could potentially, more neighbors would be welcome to a neighborhood that's proximal to a grocery store or to a health clinic. And, you know, to have that sort of 15-minute city, right, where people can drive or walk or roll to the resources that they need. I think there are things currently in Title 21 that preclude that from happening. I will say, to your point about where growth is happening in Anchorage, I think your district is more built out with multifamily than other districts, and potentially, therefore, your district would be maybe less impacted. But I also think, you know, for instance, in my neck of the woods in South Addition, there was that sort of tiny home development that was put in on 12th and Cordova. And that was something that had to go through a lot of public process in order to be built. But you have 5 homes now where there was, you know, 1 lot. So how can you create that, you know, those type of creative housing situations? And again, I think our land use plan speaks to that. Action 4.4 calls for us to amend Title 21 to allow compact housing on R2M or R3 zone lots near designated centers. So like what you're talking about, right? And so this may include increased height or allowed units per lot. So that kind of goes along with the pillars in the document that we're talking about, the variable framework. So yeah, may include increased height or allowed units per lot, subject to additional urban design and neighborhood compatibility. And that's where I think we need to zoom out and consider a lot of the actions that the Assembly has taken. This is not going to be an action in isolation. This is also consistent, again, with the ordinance that we just passed that Tom Davis worked for years on, centered around that walkability and that, the pedestrian standards. It also, part of this, all of this is the parking requirements that we repealed in order to create more opportunity for housing and walkability and adaptive reuse of vacant commercial properties. So I think we have to consider all of the levers and the pieces of the puzzle in this broader vision of how can we make Anchorage more inclusive and more affordable and more diverse when it comes to housing. Thanks.
Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. And speaking with community members, and I think in particular, and talking to folks in the industry, some of the concerns about what this potentially might do. And I understand it's not the intent, but people worry about the implications of taking this bold step, especially when we don't have a fully fleshed out proposal before us. People worry about what does this mean for infrastructure needs, and what does it mean in South Anchorage for safe egress routes, or what will this do to assess property values? And I understand that we want to do something disruptive, and it's not necessarily our or the sponsor's intent here to leave these questions unanswered. But I do worry that this process as proposed creates a lot of uncertainty. And I've heard even from, people in the industry, home builders as well, that there's a potential for the outcome to be chaotic. Again, I'm not sure that's where we're going, and I'm not sure that's what it would be. But I think, while I'm not opposed to taking a good hard look at Title 21, my concern is that if we take this step without having a fully realized proposal before us, that we introduce a level of uncertainty that I think, if anything, might have a chilling effect on building for the next year and a half. I mean, to speak to Ms. Brawley and I think Mr. Constance's point, people won't be sure what we're trying to achieve necessarily, or what the final product will look like. And I think that's going to, if anything, have the effect of slowing down what little development is taking place. And I am concerned about that.
So I have myself in the queue. This picture that's kind of at the back of your table, it has the lot footprint calculator of buildable area with the setbacks. When I think about this and no parking requirements and 30 units built on that lot, like going up 4 stories, 6 units per floor, that's really not compatible with a neighborhood, probably any neighborhood really. And so I am curious what happens with this when you think about that in the framework of actually accessing and using a lot.
Great question. And you weren't here at the last work session. So let's talk about that. So what we have is a lot, right? And that lot has features, and certain features, the variables will apply to that lot. Setback requirements, the use that's allowed under the land use designations, lot coverage restrictions, height, slope, if you happen to be on the hillside, whether or not you have a septic, right? And then there might be others. And the idea is to apply those variables to create your buildable envelope. But your buildable envelope will never exceed what your use allowed is. So depends where that lot is located, right? If you are in a single 2-family lot,
Okay, let me be specific. An R4 lot in a dense residential neighborhood, but 2 lots, or 3 lots even. So it's like 21,000 square feet or 14,000 square feet in a place that has R4 right now, which means you could go up 7 stories.
Well, so I guess the question is based on where it would exist under the use table. So the land use designation for that location, I don't know. It's going to be location specific, right? So if it's urban residential high, at some point you get into requiring at least a site plan review anyway, because it's commercial multifamily construction. So there are going to be things to be evaluated to make sure there isn't an adverse neighborhood impact. And it's still going to be constrained by whatever adopted variable limits there are. There'll still be height limitations. There'll still be setback requirements, maximum lot coverage, et cetera. It's not throwing all of that out. It's determining, are there any of them that can be universal, or after a certain land use designation, do they need to be specific because of those concerns that there would be 30 units?
So when I look at this picture isn't demonstrating an actual kind of, this is what would be allowed on a given lot. This is just a kind of it could be this, it could, any of those variables could apply to change this.
Yeah,
The
this is
idea-
not to scale or anything like
Yeah,
that.
the idea is you take the variables as known, and you apply them to the lot to create a buildable envelope. And then again, it's constrained by what those variables allow based on the use, setback requirements, et cetera, et cetera.
I would offer that this graphic doesn't help your cause. It actually probably causes more fear from misinformation than it does helpful information.
Noted. I appreciate that note. I think we can revise this. And I think really what this is supposed to imply is that we are going to have setbacks and we are going to have, potentially a maximum lot coverage percentage.
It just looks like it's about 85%.
Yeah, I hear that.
Anyone else? Ms. Alato?
Thank you. So a couple of things. I've talked between myself and I want to give a shout out to my aide, John Lang, who's done a lot of work with me on this. We've talked to a number of builders, architects, housing developers, and we've also listened really carefully to what they've run into for problems. And zoning seems to be kind of one of those number one reasons. What we're trying to get out of is perpetual rezones, variances, et cetera. And really, we're not going to be injecting chaos into the system. And the reason we're not doing that is because we're following the 2040 land use plan. Frankly, we're making it, we're wanting to make it implementable for probably the first time without a bunch of hurdles. And so that creates actually quite a bit of predictability. It does provide some flexibility, but also we need to remember for the most part, Anchorage is a built environment. It is an environment where new builds are going to primarily be infill unless they're fully new developments. And a lot of new developments are going to go through a process anyway, based on having to be platted, depending on the density, whether or not they're going to require site plan reviews or conditional use permits, that there are going to be checks and balances built in just by virtue of kind of where and what we have left to build. And so the concerns I've heard to date, frankly, haven't been economically feasible. The giant 5-story building in the middle of what's currently an R1 residential neighborhood right now, it's just not economically viable and not likely using the 2040 land use plan. And two, I will say this as someone who's been through less than favorable policy decisions before, is sometimes often we make policy to respond to an issue that's facing our community. And sometimes we have to make those policy calls that aren't popular. I mean, that was what the entire pandemic was, quite frankly. And when you're in a housing crisis or a housing emergency, you need to find a way forward. And so I appreciate all of the incremental Title 21 changes that have occurred. But for my purposes, I believe right now with zoning districts, Title 21 is fundamentally flawed, and we can get out of our own way, or we can continue to try to Band-Aid it. Thank you.
So I had one thing that I wrote a note that I didn't speak to, and this argument that mixed use development isn't happening because of zoning, I don't find that to be true. I find that the issue with mixed use continues to be a lack of a financial model that lenders will actually lend towards. My friends who are in the development world continue to tell me that HFC and those underwriters fund housing, commercial lenders fund commercial development, and getting those two things married is harder than it sounds in a marketplace where there aren't a lot of models. And so an argument that this process will help facilitate mixed use development isn't an argument that to me holds a lot of water. Again, I think you said, Mr. Volland, it's aspirational, and I appreciate that aspiration. I've been working to seed mixed use development in a number of areas in the district that I serve, but I don't think that that's going to be a result of this. I think that it's really capital that's the problem on that front, Alaska specific. I have Ms. Braga in the queue.
Thanks. I don't have probably the papers you have, but I was looking in the binder for this week. And I wonder if Ned or someone could explain what Exhibit A is. Is that this whole part that's telling me what an R3 and an R3A, R2A, is just to let me know what it looks like now versus what would change if we did one residential district?
So I have the ordinance that would be in the binder before me. What page are you referring to for an exhibit reference?
It's page 510, I believe. And it's an 11-page Exhibit A. Yeah, it starts on page 510.
Can I jump in? Hey, Karen, are you for sure that you're on ordinance 2023-66? Because there is that Title 21 omnibus also, I think, in the binder, which I think is,
No, that might be what I'm at.
yeah, because we don't
Okay.
yet have an exhibit, but we are in the process of creating.
Okay, I am looking at 66. I'm so sorry.
No problem. But just so you know, well, first of all, I think the paper that we're looking at that has the use table and the variable framework and the lot footprint calculator is on the work session page. So if you go there, you'll be able to find it. And we are
Okay.
planning, we're in the drafting process of making a memorandum that would be attached to this ordinance, the S version, that would outline some of this process that we're discussing here.
Okay, thanks so much.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief comment. I really appreciated, Member Zalatel, the example you gave from your neighborhood of kind of, what things look like on the ground. And it occurred to me, I live in the Turnigan neighborhood, and it is a more diverse place in terms of housing types than people would assume when you say the word Turnigan, right? And I think it just made me think, I guess I would encourage other members and members of the public to spend some time either walking around your neighborhood or pick another place. And then it's an interesting exercise to observe, buildings that you feel do or don't fit in the area, uses that that feel like they don't fit or are different. And then going back, making note of those and then looking at our zoning map online. I think that's an interesting, because there is that kind of, especially, our city developed over several years and, or several decades really, and a lot of it before our current zoning code. And not to argue that those places are better or worse, but I just think it's helpful to always ground ourselves in how people live in the real world and what those look like on the ground. And that can really help inform, what these policies need to look like. Thanks.
So I have one last request. When you do come up with the S version, would you also circulate a version that's marked draft but is not in markup? So it's not an S version. It's what it would be if it were clean.
Sure, we can actually do that now. We can just accept the changes and keep the draft mark on there. Is that what you're wanting?
Yeah, just so people know that it's a draft. It's not the version that's getting introduced, but it's easier to read so that you can see what's actually being proposed by the S version.
I mean, we'll have hopefully the S version to you all by Monday morning.
Yeah, that, I know, but with the S version, one that is not in the markup from the regular introduced version to the S version, like Dean knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, just like as if it were final,
Yeah, the legislative drafting format?
minus the format.
Minus the format. Okay, got it, with just a draft on it.
Yeah.
Okay, I hear what you're saying.
Please. And this was pretty enlightening conversation. Glad to have spent the time. If anyone else want to speak before we adjourn? Anyone on the phone? Okay, thank you, everybody. Very interesting conversation. We are adjourned. Have a great weekend. That was not on my calendar.
Yep, it's 10 minutes.